Well, good morning. It's great to be with you again. And we are going to be continuing with a very dense um, set of verses, dense theologically. And we talked about this last week that what I was going to do was take the last 29, almost 30 verses of chapter 5 and doing just a paragraph or two each week, so that we could just uh, eat it slowly, really chew it up before we go on with the next paragraph. Now, in doing this way, I can do the paragraph or two from the end of chapter 5, but still go on with the next story because um, uh, I'm uh, I'm going to do each story in line, but at the beginning of the class, take on those 29 verses from the end of chapter 5. So, what we're going to do is remind you, first of all, that chapter 5 was about the lame man who never believed, even though a miracle was given to him. He threw Jesus under the bus, got upset with Jesus because Jesus confronted him with his sin, uh, and, uh, and now we're uh, going on with the reaction of the Jews or the religious leaders at Jesus um, healing on the Sabbath. They didn't even look at the healing. All they looked at was that he did it on the Sabbath. To them, he was not a healer, but a Sabbath breaker. Jesus, but they come to the right conclusion, and Jesus is going to comment on their conclusion in the second half of chapter 5, which we're taking slowly. Um, so let's read this part where the Jews react, the religious leaders react to Jesus' healing on the Sabbath. And it says in verse 18, so you have John 5:18 to 47. You have 2 pages and 2 paragraphs that I'm going to deal with today. And you're going to see how theologically dense they are. This, in verse 18, this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, Jesus, because not only was Jesus breaking the Sabbath, but he was also calling God his own Father. Remember, he said, "My Father is working, and so am I working." He was calling God his own Father, and they come to the right conclusion, making himself equal with God. Now, this is when Jesus is going to start talking. We're not sure whether he's talking to all the people or just his disciples or including those Pharisees, but he's speaking and John is recording what he says. So Jesus in verse 19 said to them, now watch how he's going to take up this discussion about being equal with the Father. He's going to, in essence, say, you're right, I am equal with the Father. So let's look at that. Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord. That is, he does nothing of his own initiative. The Son's initiative is not separate from his Father's. It's equal. It's the same. They're on the same page. They're in harmony with one another. So he does nothing of his own accord, his own initiative, but only what he sees the Father doing. Now, what he's doing is referring to what happened in antiquity between a father and a son, an earthly father and an earthly son. And that is in the time of Jesus and generations past, was that the father taught the son what he did. Um, if the father was a carpenter, the son always became a carpenter. He was taught by the father carpentry. He did not become a barber. He did not become a farmer. He did not become anything but what the father taught him. And so the son watched the father and what the father was doing. So what Jesus is doing is taking a life a situation and bringing it in to describe his situation with the father. And so he says, the son can do nothing of his own initiative, but only what he sees his father doing. And they could grasp that, because that's exactly what life was like back then. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. In other words, it's impossible for the Son to take independent action that would set him against the Father. He's not going to go against the Father. He is going to be in accordance with the Father. For the Father loves the Son and shows him, the Son, all that he himself is doing. The Father reveals everything to the Son. Why? Because the Father loves the Son. There's this inner communication between equals. The Father and the Son are equal. They both do the same things. And in other words, the Father and the Son are on the same page. Now, the second paragraph, I told you we were going to do one or two paragraphs, and this week it's the two paragraphs. And watch how he continues this thing about the Father and Son being equal. It says, and greater works than these will he, the Father, show him, the Son. So you've seen the works that he's done. He's turned water into wine. He has healed the official son from a distance, and he has healed the lame man. He says there's going to be even greater works than these. For, in verse 21, as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. See, what the Father does, the Son does. And the Son is going to raise the dead, as we see in what story in John? The Lazarus story. Yes. So, and watch this, the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. Wait a second. All through the Old Testament, we learned that God judges. God does the judging. It's his responsibility. He calls himself the judge. These comments about the Father, declarations about God, are that God is the one and only judge. But what does this say? It says now, the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, because the Son is equal to the Father. That's why watch this, why does the Father give all judgment to the Son? That all may honor the Son. Here's the clincher, that second line. Just as they honor the Father. All the honor that is given to the Father is given to the Son. All the honor that's given to the Son is given to the Father. The one who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Yep, the Father and the Son are equal. And how are they equal? Well, this set of verses tells us they both give life, they both resurrect, they both judge, and they receive the same honor. The Father and Son work in harmony. Jesus will later say that the Father and I are one. Okay, so we've now taken those two verses from the end of chapter 5, after Jesus has healed the lame man, and the Pharisees, the religious leaders, are all saying, "Oh, well, he needs to be destroyed, killed, because he not only works on and heals on the Sabbath, he makes himself equal with God." And they couldn't stand that. And so what Jesus does is he continues to show himself as equal with the Father. Okay, so now we're on John 6 in play form. Somebody said that I needed to show the page, and so I'm going to try to remember to do that. In John 6 in play form, we're next in the next chapter, and this is the chapter about the feeding of the 5,000. This is the only sign that is given in all four Gospels. Now, you have the storm on the sea in all four Gospels, but some of the Gospels do the one where he walks on water. Other Gospels talk about him just making the water, the storm, calming the storm. But in this one, it's the bread scene. It's all the same in each one. Now, each one tells it slightly differently, includes things that others. So in Mark, it doesn't include that there was a boy who had the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But in John, we're going to bring in the boy who provided the food for the sign. So what you're going to do is circle, as we're reading this, the crowd and any reference to a huge number of people. We are going to see that there's an abundant amount of food in this. So I want you to take note of how it keeps on repeating things that tell us how abundant that food is that Jesus is providing. So the narrator says, after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd, what are you going to do? Circle, large crowd, was following Jesus because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Well, whenever we see something like that, we need to stop and think. They're only following, doesn't even say they're believing. It's just that they're following because they see the signs. If this were the only reason, how is this reason flawed? And we know that many people saw it, many people even believed, many people followed, but it was only because of the signs. Whereas when we saw the Samaritan woman, we saw that she believed without even a sign. And even the official who he believes Jesus's word and follows Jesus' directive to go home he believes it without seeing the sign. And that is what Jesus wants. Now, the signs were a good thing. They showed that Jesus was who he says he is. But the people are just following without just because of the signs. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Now, do you remember the first Passover that we heard of in John? That was the Passover when Jesus came into Jerusalem and cleansed the temple. Remember that? So that happened probably a little less than a year into his ministry. Now the second Passover. We're not going to hear that he goes to Jerusalem, but I would say he probably does. We're going to just hear something he did around Passover time. And so this is the second Passover. And then the third Passover will be the one when he goes to Jerusalem again and he dies as the Passover lamb and is resurrected and ascends. So now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus spoke to Philip. Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? And the narrator says, he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Now, when John tells us that Jesus was only saying this to test Philip, it was proving that Jesus is not stumped by this question. No, he knew all along what was going to happen. Jesus had already his own plan. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. Does that tell you how many people were there? Yes. 200 denarii was 8 months' wages for a common laborer. So 8 months later, wages was not even going to give them, enough, a morsel of bread. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke to Jesus. There is a boy here. Here's where we get the story of the boy. It's in John's gospel, not in Mark's. There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what is that? What are they among so many? The doubt is here. 5 barley loaves is the barley bread was the staple of the poor. There was a barley season which came first, and that was in the spring around Passover time. And after the barley harvest, there was a wheat harvest. And the barley harvest gave the bread for the poor. It was rougher texture in bread. But the wheat harvest was saved for the rich who could afford it. And that was a much softer kind of bread. We noticed that too in the difference. Look at this. But what are they? 5 loaves and 2 fishes among so many. Another reference to how many people are there. And Jesus said, have the people recline. Now, in your Bible, it might say, have the people sit down. But they did not sit down to eat. You had no chairs for those who were the common people. They did not sit, they reclined. Normally at a meal, and you think of the stories where Jesus ate at people's homes, they had a center low table or just a cloth on the table, on the floor. And people reclined on their side, leaning on their left hand and eating with their right. It seems very uncomfortable to us because we're used to chairs, but they did not, only the rich had chairs. So they had learned to eat in a reclining position, so it was normal for them. They got used to it. So he has them recline. And the narrator says, now there was much grass in the place. Now this is an incidental remark. It has nothing to do with this story. It doesn't add to it anything important. And so we know that there must be a reason why John includes the fact that there was much grass in the place. So the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Now, 5,000 men were there. And so theologians, scholars, guess that there must have been, including women and children. We know that children are there because of this boy, women and children. There probably were more than 20,000 people there. So when he tells us that there were 5,000 men, he's telling us that we need an abundance of food. And so he's telling us there's really a big crowd. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were reclining. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. So, did you hear that? As much as they wanted. You can imagine with the fish and the loaves and people who are poor and don't get free things, that they stuff themselves. But even though they had stuffed themselves, there's leftovers. Look what it says. He spoke to his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. There's an abundance of food, both fish and bread, and left over. So therefore, there was an abundance of food that Jesus provides for them, and they are thrilled. The narrator says, so they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments from the 5 loaves, barley loaves left by those who had eaten. He's telling you, there were only 5 loaves, but we have 12 baskets full of the fragments from that, left by those who had eaten. There was more left over than when they first started. There was an abundance of food. And it reminds us of the abundance of wine at the wedding feast of Cana. Remember, we talked about that? There was such an abundance that it probably, of wine, that it probably could have filled 5 or 6, in fact, it was 6, bathtubs full of wine. That's how many barrels there were, and they were used for purification, the water for purification, and Jesus changed that water for purification into wine. There was an abundant supply of wine. Cana was a very small town, and you're talking about a wedding feast of one family. So how many people were there? Not hundreds, that's for sure, because they couldn't have afforded that. But so there, an abundant amount of good wine, delicious wine, was provided by Jesus. So we should look at these 2 stories in concert with one another. Jesus is providing good, delicious wine, abundant wine, more than was needed. And he's providing bread and fish, a feast, more than was needed for his people. In fact, those 12 baskets are, by many theologians, believe that those 12 baskets represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And it shows that Jesus was providing abundantly for the people of Israel. In verse 14, it says, when the people saw the sign, remember, each of the signs, we're told that they're a sign. Remember the first sign in Cana? It tells you this is the first sign, the provision of wine. The second one was the official's son who was healed. And John tells us this was the second sign, expecting us to continue counting the signs. And when you count things in John, the normal thing is that they're going to come up with 7. And there are 7 signs. Now we just talked about the first 2 signs. The third sign was the lame man healed. And then the fourth sign is this. This is the fourth sign. We still have 3 more to go, including the resurrection, which is called by Jesus a sign. Okay, so the people say, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. They're right. They see him provide bread, just like Moses. And in Deuteronomy chapter 18, I'd like you to get your Bible out to Deuteronomy 18, even though we've gone over it many times. This is probably the second most important prophecy in the Old Testament concerning the Messiah to come. It's the prophecy that the Samaritan woman is referring to. It's the prophecy that all 4 Gospels tell us that is fulfilled in Jesus. And the prophecy that Peter, in his first sermon, refers to when he says Jesus is that prophet. And the prophecy Stephen refers to in his message just before he's stoned to death. He says, Jesus is that prophet, and you rejected him. So in Deuteronomy chapter 18, we have the prophecy that we're talking about. It says this, Yahweh your God, Moses says, will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. And then 2 verses later, it tells us in verse 18 that what Yahweh says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, Moses, from among their brothers. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. This is about Jesus. The Gospels show this. The people saw it. He must be that prophet who's to come. The prophet who is to come. They're referring back to this story. Why? Because he does something that Moses does. A prophet like Moses. And at the end of Deuteronomy, it says this, that prophet hasn't arisen yet. But he now becomes a prophet like Moses. And so when they hear this, they realize, if he's that prophet like Moses, he must be the Messiah. And the Messiah is going to be king. And we're waiting for a king. In fact, it's Passover time when at the original Passover, Moses is going to deliver his people from the Egyptians. So if Jesus is the prophet like Moses, then he must be ready to deliver his people from not the Egyptians, but the Romans. And so they want to make him king because he's going to deliver them and provide manna for them. But Jesus sneaks away because he knows, though he is the prophet like Moses, though he is the Messiah king, this is not the kind of king he's supposed to be, the kind that they expect, the kind who will just come and deliver them from the Romans. He's going to be the king who delivers them, more importantly, from their sin. He's going to die for them. Okay, then the next bit is showing again that Jesus is a prophet like Moses. Now, we saw this when we were looking at Moses who crosses the Red Sea. Then Joshua looked a little like Moses, didn't he? Because he crosses the Jordan River that's parted. Then Elijah looks a little bit like Moses and Joshua because they throw the mantle down, and the Jordan opens up for them. And the same thing happens to Elisha. He uses Elijah's mantle and opens up the river so he can pass through. Yes. So now we're going to see it in relationship to the bread scenes. Each of the prophets looks like a little like Moses and a little like Jesus. So let's read through. In Exodus 16, so there's 3, so that you can compare as we're reading. I want you, by the way, to circle 2 things. One is bread, and the other is leftovers. So I want you to circle those 2 things. Exodus 16. In the morning, when the layer of dew evaporated, behold, on the surface of the wilderness there was a fine flake-like thing. When the sons of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread which Yahweh has given you to eat." Notice bread. Did you circle it? Good. This is what Yahweh has commanded. Gather of it every man as much as he should eat. Just gather all that you can eat on a given morning. He who had gathered much had no excess, and he who had gathered little had no lack. Every man gathered as much as he should eat. Sounds a little like John 6, doesn't it? Now, on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread because they're not going to be allowed to gather bread on the Sabbath. So they gather enough bread for 2 days. Jesus said to them, "Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside until morning, until the Sabbath." So you see that we have bread and we have leftovers. Psalm 78:24 says this: Yahweh rained down like a flood, like a storm of manna upon them to eat, and gave them bread from heaven. So the manna was bread from heaven. 1 Kings 17:8-16. Then the word of Yahweh came to Elijah. "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon." This is Gentile country. This is up north of Israel in Sidon. "And dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow She's going to be a Gentile widow. There to feed you. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. There's bread. And she said, As Yahweh your... She even knows Yahweh's name. She must have heard about Yahweh and heard all the stories. And so she said, As Yahweh your God lives, he's not her God yet, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I am gathering a couple of sticks, that I may go and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat and die. In famine times, people died. There were no trains, planes, automobiles to truck in food from other states and other countries. You died in famine times. And that's what she knew was going to happen to her. So she's saying, Elijah, really, I only have enough for my son and I to eat, and then we're going to die. We have no more. And Elijah said to her, this Gentile widow, Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterward, make something for yourself and your son. For thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that Yahweh sends rain upon the earth. And she went and did as Elijah said. Now, did she have any idea that this might be so? No, but she believes Elijah and the God of Israel, because he says, For thus says Yahweh. Before any miracle, she believes. And so it says, and she went and did as Elijah said, and she did it. And she and he, her son, and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty. A repetition. First, Elijah tells her that this is going to happen. And now we're told that it did happen according to the word of Yahweh that he spoke through Elijah. So Moses provides bread, and there are leftovers. Elijah provides, gives the woman bread, and there are leftovers, aren't there? Leftovers. 2 Kings 4. Now a man brought the man of God. Now this is during famine again. There's another famine in the time of Elisha, like the time of Elijah. But a man of God brought the man of God. This man brings to Elisha and his students, called the sons of the prophets, the bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. It's during famine, and look what he brings. He lives in the northern kingdom, this man, amongst an apostate nation. The Jews have become apostate. They're following other gods, but there is still a remnant. And one of that remnant is this man. And look what he does during a famine. He brings the first fruits. What are the first fruits? Well, the first fruits are the first of the harvest that he has reaped, and he's bringing that. Now, what tells you that that is a very faith-filled action? And that is because if you give the first fruits, is God going to supply after that? And he says, I believe God will supply. That's what he's saying, really, this man. By bringing the first fruits to Elisha, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha says, give them to the people that they may eat. So we have a provision of bread, just like the woman provided bread for Elijah. His attendant said, what? Why set this before 100 men? In other words, how is this 20 loaves, loaves in those days were small, going to provide enough food for these men to eat? But Elisha said, give them to the people that they may eat. For thus says Yahweh, they shall eat and have some left over. So he set it before them, and they ate, and they had some left over, just as the woman had, because every time she took flour, every time she took oil in order to make bread, it got refilled again. So that was the leftover. And now we have leftover, according to the word of Yahweh. Remember, it had said, according to the word of Yahweh that he spoke through Elijah in the previous story. And it was always according to the word of Yahweh when Moses had the manna there. Well, we can see that these stories lead up to John 6. There's a provision of abundant food in John 6, in Exodus 16, in 1 Kings 17, and in 2 Kings 4. Abundant food with leftovers. Got it? Let me just see how much. Oh, good. I have enough time to do the last page because this is the one that I get excited about. Remember, I told you the abundance of food in John 6 and the abundance of wine in John 2. They are working concert with one another to give us foreshadowing of something that was predicted in the Old Testament. The Old Testament predicts that there's going to be a feast in the end times. Now, there's quite a number of those predictions in the Old Testament, but I'm only going to look at the two most important ones. But these predictions say that there is going to be a marriage covenant in the future age. And so what, and it describes it as being abundant food and abundant wine, much to eat, much to drink. And so it's talking about, like Revelation, at the end of Revelation, talks about the marriage supper of the Lamb, the marriage feast of the Lamb. That's at the end of, it's called the eschaton, or the end of the age, the new heavens and the new earth. We're going to have a marriage supper where there's a feast And who knows how long that feast is going to last. Is it for we're going to be able to eat and eat and eat. And so what Jesus does is he gives evidence that he's that Messiah who's going to bring that about, because that's the work of the future Messiah. So let's look at John as 6 and John 2 as working in concert to picture what happened, what the Old Testament says will happen in the future, and what the Revelation says this will happen. So Jesus foreshadows it. Let's watch it, and we'll see how John links these to those two scriptures and more scriptures that predict this. Jesus went up on the mountain. I want to show you something. It says a mountain here, but look at this at the bottom. It says, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. We have a what? Bookends. So around the story, we have bookends. And that is why I have it in bold print. I want you to take note of that bold print, because that's going to tell us something. Verse 3, Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he reclined with his disciples. And Jesus said, have the people recline. Now there was much grass in the place. Now we said that was extra information that didn't seem to play a part in this gospel, but we're going to see that it does play a part in Jesus foreshadowing the future. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men reclined. About 5,000. Notice we have 3 times we're talking about reclining. About 5,000 in number. And Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were reclined. Notice this is 4 times. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. Remember all the from the Old Testament, the previous stories this is Jesus doing the prophet thing. And they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments. I mean, here's maybe 20,000 or more people, and he can provide for all those people and still have 12 baskets of fragments left over from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So it begins with him being in the mountain, and it ends with him being in the mountain. Okay? So that's the food thing. Abundant. People having their fill. An exorbitant amount to fill up completely 20,000 people. Now there were, now in John 2, we're going to remember the wine thing. Now there were 6 stone jars. That means a whole lot. 6 bathtubs full. There for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Whew! Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they weren't completely full. He completely filled with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. And when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first. When the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. And we talked about this word good. We kind of think, good is good, you know. But in biblical language, good is the top way that you can describe anything as being wonderful, extraordinary, because God describes his creation as good. Remember? And God saw that it was good. Good is used for a superlative. And so this wine, being good, was marvelous, delicious, extraordinary wine. Okay, so we have delicious, good food and wine that Jesus is giving to his people. Why? Because what he's doing is saying, remember what they said about the feast in the marriage covenant in the Old Testament, that there was one to come in the future age? I'm going to foreshadow that. And so let's look at those two verses I've been talking about and seeing how John links his story up with these two verses. First, in verse 6, Isaiah 25:6, it says, on this mountain, Yahweh of hosts will make for all people a feast. Where? On the mountain. Do you remember our bookends around the feast that Jesus provides? He's on the mountain. A feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. And I put it out on a piece of paper so that you can see the parallelism that's going on. What he says in the top line, he's going to repeat, only define it in a greater way. This is called Hebrew parallelism. Rich food, a feast. Well-aged wine. Rich food full of marrow, even better yet. Aged wine, well refined. So he's repeating because it's going to be so delicious, so wonderful that he has to repeat it. And then, we have the wine in John chapter 2 and the rich food in Jesus's miracle. And this is why the people thought he must be the Messiah. He's providing this rich food, this rich wine. Look at Ezekiel 34:14. And it says this, Yahweh will feed them with good pasture. Pasture, there's no such word in the Hebrew. It's just grass. Now we translate it pasture because pasture is what sheep and cows get their food from, the grass. But in Hebrew, it just means grass, the grass for sheep and cattle and things like that. So Yahweh will feed them with good grass. Remember what we said about John just mentioning that there was much grass in the place and that there was no reason to provide that information? Well, John is linking his story with these prophecies, and these prophecies say Yahweh will feed them with good grass. as though Yahweh is going to feed them like a good shepherd feeds his sheep, good grass. So Yahweh will feed them with good grass and on the mountain heights. Again, a reference to the mountain that John brings out. Uh, and on the mountain heights of Israel shall be their grazing land. He's talking to Ezekiel and is showing Yahweh to be the shepherd that provides, that's going to provide rich food in the future age. And so it says, their grazing land. There they shall recline. What did they do in John? Recline, recline, recline. On good grazing land, on rich grass or pasture. They shall feed on the mountains of Israel. We have bookends, don't we? The mountains of Israel in the first part, and at the end, the mountains of Israel in the second part. So what we have here are only two of the verses that speak of this wonderful feast in the end times. And Jesus foreshadows that feast in the provision of much wine, delicious wine, an overabundance of bread and fish, so that they're full and there's leftovers in each of those stories, plenty for them. Jesus is foreshadowing the future age to come when he will return a second time and have the marriage supper of the Lamb. So this is an exciting thing for us to look forward to. And Jesus is foreshadowing it for us. So thank you for being with me again. And next week we will be going on for the next miracle, and that will be the miracle of the provision of Jesus calming the sea. So let me